Welcome to the place where people of faith find real answers. We believe women deserve more than just religious band-aids for their most difficult and destructive relationships. And now for today's episode of Relationship Truth Unfiltered.
Welcome. I am Leslie Vernick, and I am so excited about our guest today. Beth Allison Barr is a true scholar with a PhD in medieval history. She's also the author of 5 books, including her latest, Becoming the Pastor's Wife: How Marriage Replaced Ordination as Woman's Path to Ministry, and my personal favorite, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. In addition to her impressive research, Beth brings 25 years of experience as a pastor's wife to this new book. And Beth, I just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
What in the world motivated you to write a book as an academic person about pastors' wives?
That's a really good question. I will say before I wrote The Making of Biblical Womanhood, this book was not on my radar. And when I wrote The Making of Biblical Womanhood, I tell people that it was what I'd been teaching for a long time. And I knew most of the story that I wrote. It was part of my research. It was part of what I had been teaching. But there were also threads to it that I didn't really have time to explore in The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And so when I finished it and when people began asking me what my next book would be, before saying no, my first impulse was to say no and just be like, I'm done. I'm going back to the world of medieval sermons. But I didn't. And I sat with it and I talked to some people. And I remember Scott McKnight gave me some really good advice. He said, Beth, is there anything that you left unsaid that you think would help if you said it? And that got me thinking. And I was also reading a book from one of my colleagues at Baylor, whose name is Elizabeth Flowers. And she has a really fantastic book called Into the Pulpit about Southern Baptist women in the post-World War II era. And she has a comment in there where she's talking about the rise of complementarian theology, which is, of course, the theology that teaches that women are called by God to be subordinate to men. And she writes about how some of the most vocal advocates for that position in the Southern Baptist Church were pastors' wives. And this made me start thinking about the connection between what I knew and my life in the complementarian world as a pastor's wife and its connection to the promotion of this ideology that subordinates women and has done so much harm. And so I decided to start exploring that connection. And that is what gave birth 2 years later to Becoming the Pastor's Wife.
Wow. So as you researched all these books, I think you said in your paper 150 books about pastors' wives over the last century. What surprised you the most?
We had this idea that the pastor's wife is something that has always been there in the church, that it is sort of this ever-present role that has always been the same. And I think what really surprised me about the pastor's wife books is that there is a significant shift in how women talk about the pastor's wife role and how women are portrayed in it. And that shift is actually fairly recent in history. It really starts changing in the 1980s. And this to me was, I have people all the time, they're like, the pastor's wife has always been there. There's not like, this isn't a constructed role. And I'm just like, you have no idea how much the pastor's wife role has changed, is a product of a very particular historical circumstance, and also has become something very different in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And so I think that's one of the things that really surprised me was how clear this change was in the pastor's wife literature.
I remember thinking to myself, and I read it in your book, and I'm thinking, okay, yes, she's right. Where's Peter's wife? Where is Peter's wife? Here's Peter, the head of the church, and we hear about his mother-in-law, but we don't hear much about his wife at all. And if the pastor's wife is supposed to be such a right hand arm of the pastor. Where is she?
This is certainly something when I started thinking about the concept of biblical womanhood, which is what I explored in the making of biblical womanhood, showing that this is not a really biblical concept, that it is a cultural construct that, again, was constructed in a very particular moment in the 20th century and has seeds in the 19th century. And this is the same thing that we see with this understanding of the pastor's wife. And this, I especially pastor's wife literature since the 1980s, you see this continuous theme in it that the pastor's wife role is a biblical role and that it is something that God called women specifically to do this job and that there are biblical precedents for women to do this job. But when you actually look to see what they're quoting, they're simply quoting the household codes and trying to tie it to like various women in the Bible. Like some people talk about Sarah as being a pastor's wife, which is really kind of fascinating. And some people, talk about like Prisca and Aquila. Dorothy Patterson has this fantastic and wrong passage where she argues that Prisca is kind of the ideal pastor's wife because she's supporting her husband's ministry. And that caught my attention because it is so wrong. What we get from reading the Bible is that Aquila is supporting Prisca's ministry and not the other way around.
Why,
And
she was the front person.
yeah, she was the front person, indeed. In fact, I think I say in the book that it's possible that Aquila is the first pastor's husband, maybe, and that we actually may have more evidence for that role in thinking about Priscilla and Aquila than this role of the pastor's wife. And so I wanted women to read this who have been taught that their role is sanctioned by God and tied up in this biblical model, that this is actually not true. Now, it doesn't mean it's not an important role. It just means that it is not a role that we find put forward for women in the Bible. And I think that's a really important point for women to hear.
Yeah. So, in other words, if you're married to a man in ministry, the pastor's wife or the missionary's wife, it doesn't necessarily mean that God says that you're to also be on the front lines doing that. It'd be okay for you to do something else if that's your gifting or calling. But in the way that the change in the complementarian and biblical womanhood, I don't know the right word, but the way that they've phrased that, it is your mandate by God. If your husband has that role, then you must also have that role.
It's exactly right. And you can think about, I hear from women all the time who told me that they gave up their own calling. They were told it was selfish and prideful. If they were called into another type of ministry position, or if they were just called to do something else entirely. And they were taught that their job given by God was to support their husband's ministry. And if they did anything else, that this was actually selfish and sinful. And this is something you see so clearly in this pastor's wife literature. In fact, I think Christine Hoover, who, I think is a really fantastic person, but one of the things that she argues, she says the pastor's wife role is a fellowship role, and that you are to subordinate what you believe are your own desires to this job of your husband. And so, you can just imagine the guilt that women carry who really feel called to do something different, but yet feel like that's being sinful or prideful or selfish if they follow those callings.
Beth, I would expand that idea even further because women in our listening audience may not be married to a pastor. They might be married to a salesperson, or they might be married to an engineer or a doctor. And that philosophy is,
Yep.
hey, as a wife, your career is always secondary to your
Yes.
husband's career.
Yeah.
That your primary role is to support him in his career. And if you can have a little spare time to do something you want to, that's okay. But if your career interferes with your role as a mom or a wife in any way, you're bad, you're sinning. That's outside of God's plan.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the interesting things about the pastor's wife role is that it, on the one hand, is simply this model of biblical womanhood. But because she's married to the pastor, she becomes the ideal for this model. And so pastors' wives, they not only are called to support their husbands, but they are also called to be this ideal version of what a biblical woman should be. And so they have even more pressure put on them because they are called to carry this idea within the church. And so this is also why anytime a pastor's wife does something that deviates from the idea of biblical womanhood, that she can be called publicly out for it, or her husband is punished for it. And it's because this role, in some ways, the pastor's wife role helps to support this ideology, this complementarian theology. And so, literally, not only can the husband not do his job without his wife, but complementarian theology won't be successful without the role of the pastor's wife.
So you've been a pastor's wife
I have.
for 25 years.
Yeah.
What's a story from your experience that really captures these challenges and some expectations that you found surprising in this role?
Oh gosh, always I think with pastors' wives, we have so many stories that we have just hidden away. And I remember one time I was at a pastor's wife conference. I talk about it briefly in the book. It's the only time I went to a specifically pastor's wife conference. And I remember I was talking with one of the pastor's wives in our churches, and we were getting to know each other. And I was just asking her a question that I thought was just a common question. This was at the senior pastor's wife. So I just asked her what challenges that she'd maybe had at this church, because I was relatively new at this church, and if she had any advice for me or any sort of thing. And she sat there for a minute, and then she was like, "I don't think I should talk about that with you." And I remember it was just like this kind of like this closed door, like that somehow I had asked her to gossip, or I'd asked her to tell stories maybe, or I don't know what it was, but it was like this slam door. And I remember after that, one of the sessions we were in, it talked about how the pastor's wife needs to not, while on one hand, she needs to be friendly to everybody and hospitable to everybody, she shouldn't have close friends in the church, because this could give way to gossiping and making it look like there were cliques or exclusivity. And I suddenly realized that that pastor's wife had put up this boundary between us, that I could be friendly with her, but we weren't friends in that sense. We were there for a purpose, and that wasn't to have that was I couldn't have that type of friendship within the church. And that I remember feeling like this cold feeling. I was actually pregnant with our son at the time, and I just remember just thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is a different world." So, anyway, that's one of them. I could tell you pastor's wife stories all day.
And I could
Right
too.
here.
But what I'm getting at is that the woman feels like I can't be real.
Yeah.
I have to have an image to maintain. And I
Oh
think
gosh. Yeah.
a pastor probably feels that pressure too, that I have to have an image. I can't have real friends because if he sees my flaws, or if my elder board knows that I just prepared my sermon last night at the last minute, I'm going to get fired. And so
Yeah.
it's hard to be real. It's hard to be honest. It's hard to be vulnerable with our humanity.
It's
We
exactly
can't
right.
have a messy house. We can't have kids that misbehave because somehow that's against the ideal image that we're trying to portray.
Well, that's absolutely right. I remember, especially when I was a younger pastor's wife, that what I wore to church was something that I thought a lot about, because I knew it carried messages with it, what I wore, and it could be critiqued by people around me. And if I was looking the way that I was supposed to look. I also remember because, when I became a pastor's wife, I was also a PhD student working on my doctorate. And I found out really quickly that I needed to minimize that part of my life and not talk about it at church, because it wasn't something that fit the mold of what the pastor's wife should be. And so I needed to kind of like put it to the side, especially since I was studying women's history. That was something that I had to minimize in my life when I was at church.
And I'm sure there's lots of women who are listening who can relate to that, that they couldn't be if their husband was the missionary or even the elder or the deacon, any position of influence, even the small group leader. It's really hard to be authentic and real as a woman, as a person. And I think women especially want that. They want that connection. They
Yeah.
want that authenticity. They want that real friendship. And so it's so much pressure for her to create this everything's fine and my kids are
Yeah.
well and our house is clean and I've got dinner ready and all of that's exhausting.
I think some of the saddest things I read in the pastor's wife books were the concerns about weight and appearance. I remember reading this one book. I didn't talk about it. I read a lot of things that I didn't talk about in the pastor's wife books, but I think it was called The Confessions of Being a Pastor's Wife or something. But it probably wasn't read. It was independently published. And it was like, I think it was written like in the late 80s. And this woman, she was having babies. There's a lot of pressure on a pastor's wife and women in evangelical culture, and a lot of women gain weight while they're while they're having babies. I mean, and some women's bodies are more prone to this than others. And I remember her telling a story about how she put on this outfit that she thought she looked really good in, and a congregant walked up to her and asked her why she looked like an orange balloon. And it was just, and I was just like, why do people think they can say things like that, especially to pastors' wives? And I think that's one that people feel like the pastor's wife is a property and they can talk to her however they want to, including harmful things about her appearance that women carry with them. It just broke my heart reading that story.
Yeah, these are burdens that the pastor's wife have to carry that pretty much every pastor's wife has to carry.
Feeling inspired by the wisdom you've been soaking up today? If you're nodding along and thinking, yes, I want more of that, then you're going to love what we have for you. Walking in Core Strength is the ultimate program for women like you ready to break free from destructive relationship patterns. Led by Leslie Vernick's team of phenomenal coaches, this isn't just another class. It's a game changer for your life. So, if you're sick of being stuck and are ready to step into your true potential, head over to leslievernick.com/strength and sign up now. Let's make it happen.
Then I'd like to talk about a little bit in a bit the harder burdens, like when your pastor is not so healthy and your
Yes.
husband is hurting you. But I want to, before we get to that, because we'll probably talk a little bit about that more, I'm intrigued by your research into the Black churches
Yes.
and how they've approached the whole role of the pastor's wife very differently. And what do you think our white Anglo-Saxon churches could learn from this tradition?
I think we could learn so much. Now, this was another thing that I found in reading the pastor's wife literature is I found that more recently in the Black church, especially in post 2000 world, we see the Black church, Black pastor's wife books are starting to pick up the language and the complementarian theology that we find in white pastor's wife books. But this is a shift in Black pastor's wife literature. And when I was reading the Black pastor's wife books, like in the 80s and the 90s, and even in the 70s, one of the first ones is actually written in the 40s. It's one of the first pastor's wife books that I read. And one of the things that really struck me about the Black pastor's wife books is that they don't pretend that the pastor's wife role is a biblical model. They just don't pretend that it is. They're like, this is something created in culture. And the reason that the pastor's wife needs to look good and support her husband is because of racism, because our husbands have been beaten down by this US system that has not only enslaved them but also has said that they are worth less than white men. And so it's not that you're supposed to be subordinate to your husband in this way. It's that you help to, you can help lift your husband up. And so, I mean, so people read it. People are like, oh, well, Black pastors' wives are saying the same things as white pastors' wives. And I'm like, actually, they're not. Yes, they're saying that they need to dress well, but the reason that they dress well is because because they're showing the significance of their ministry role, and they're helping to lift up their families. And that's very different than telling the white pastor's wife that her inability to stay as skinny as they think she should be is because of her inability to be steeped in the spirit. That's actually what it's told, is that if you're not holy enough, then that weight control is a holiness issue. And that's a very different message than what you find being given in The Black Pastor's Wife. And in fact, I didn't hear much about weight control in Black Pastor's Wife. They talked about looking nice and wearing makeup and having nice clothes, but it was like anybody can look good. You don't have to make your body look a particular way, which again is a very different message.
And also, the pastors' wives in the Black church seem to have a whole lot more
Power?
authority and a power and equal status to their husband.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Black pastors' wives are often co-pastors. If they choose to be, they're often ministering, preaching. Also, this was one of the most astounding things that I read, and it was a book by Weptona Carter, who wrote it in the late 70s, and she was a wife of a progressive Black pastor, that Progressive Baptist, which is a denomination, a Progressive Baptist. She actually wrote in her book, she was like, hey, look, if you don't feel like your ministry is to support your husband's church, that's fine. She was like, you can find your ministry elsewhere. And I was just like, oh my gosh. She says ministry is important, that you need to be involved in ministry, but she was like, do it where you feel called. And if it's not your church, that's fine. And I was like, that's not something you would ever hear in Dorothy Patterson era white pastor's wife books. And so again, it's a model where we see, because they don't argue that it's a biblical model, they argue it's a cultural model, and that a lot of the things they're doing are rooted in the Black history of racism in the US, that they also approach it in more of a, you do what you feel called to do within this. And it was so freeing to me to read some of those.
Beth, one of the things that you mentioned just really briefly, and I don't want to take a lot of time of expanding on it, but I do think it's important for us to talk a little bit about for our listeners. You said that this whole complementarian theology really grew in the 70s, 80s. And before that, I mean, you're a medieval history professor.
Yeah.
What was the role of women in the church in medieval times? So we think about the women who were at Jesus's feet at the cross. We think about women who Mary Magdalene has seen as the apostle to the apostles, I think. And so what is it that happened? That were women allowed in the church? Were women preaching in the church in medieval times? Was it the Protestant? Well, the Protestant church wasn't the Protestant church at the time, but the Catholic church. I mean, were women
Yeah.
in power then?
Yeah. So I always have to put in a caveat. On the one hand, we always find women in less leadership roles than men, wherever we are. This is the history of patriarchy. A lot we could talk about that. However, in the medieval church, there was space for ordained women. Women were ordained in the medieval church. That's one of the things I talk about in the book. I also talk about that and women were holding what we would consider to be pastoral positions, especially in the early medieval world. We start to see a shift in the medieval world in the Central Middle Ages. Really around the 13th century is where we start to see some things changing. But before that time, we have, the medieval church had a strong history of women serving in leadership positions and women preaching. I mean, in fact, one of the most famous preachers in the medieval church was Mary Magdalene. They believed that Mary Magdalene, when she was given the word that Jesus was resurrected by Jesus himself, that this was actually an empowering, and that Mary Magdalene continued preaching the gospel from that time forward. And she actually, with her sister Martha, they went off into France. That's what the medieval church believed. And they really started the Western church through their preaching. And there's a very interesting part of this medieval narrative in which we see Peter back in Jerusalem, back in the Holy Land, well, back in Rome, sorry. And he empowers, somebody comes and says, hey, Mary and Martha are off preaching off here. And Peter's like, yes, and they have my blessing. He's like, and so we see an apostle bestowing that authority to preach on these women. So we see in the medieval world this legacy of female preachers and female authority. And they never completely lose that. And so we will see throughout medieval history, you will see women serving in important religious authority roles and preaching, hosting authority over men. One of the examples I give, one of the most famous women who does this is Hildegard of Bingen, who in the 11th century, she not only she's a monastic, but she's also brilliant. But she goes on preaching tours throughout Europe, and she's preaching to lay congregants, ordinary people, as well as clergymen. And we see this continuing all the way through. Another woman is Catherine of Siena in the 15th century, who convinces the Pope to go back to end the Avignon papacy and to actually go back to Rome. And again, this type of female authority exercising over the most significant spiritual leaders in the Catholic Church.
I think this is really interesting, and I wish we had more time. Maybe we'll have you back to unpack some of this, because some of our listeners are going to be like, well, maybe they were all wrong back then and we've got it right now, right?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
were they all right back then and we've gotten it wrong now? And I think that's the dilemma. That's the dilemma of where we have to put our own thinking caps on and ask ourselves, why did things change? Were
Yeah.
the things changing in the 70s and 80s because there's some really, really godly men who got some insight from God and a whole new perspective of how women are to be? Or
Yep.
were they threatened by the rise of feminine movement in the culture
Yes.
and started to feel like that was going to upend the church?
So I'll say two things. One, to maybe help some of your listeners who are like, well, maybe they were just wrong in the medieval world. What I would challenge them to do is to go to their Bible and read Romans 16. Read it, and I would suggest to them that they don't read it the first time in the ESV, because the ESV is written to downplay, is translated to downplay women's authority, and that's actually an established fact. So I would read it in a different version, and I would just go through and write out all of the women who you see in that chapter, and then I'd write out what you see them doing. And what you will see women doing in that chapter is you will see women referred to as apostle, as deacon, and as house church leader. And so I then think about what that means. It means that the only positions that we really see in the earliest church are all being fulfilled by women, and no one's concerned about it. In fact, Paul is commending them for what they're doing. So that's the first thing that I would say. I want them to go and think about that. And then the second thing that I would say is, if you think about in the modern world, I know a lot of people here, they're like, oh, well, this is just a feminist push to try to get women into leadership. And I'm like, okay, yes, we do see this connection with what happens in the 60s and 70s. But I want you to think about what's going on in that feminist push. And what we see going on is we see women receiving equalizing opportunities in the broader culture, including equal pay for equal work, including not being discriminated against. Like, for example, I tell my students this. I'm like, did you know that women couldn't buy houses on their own without male
I
co-signers?
couldn't. When
Yeah.
I graduated from college
Yes.
with a degree, I could not buy a car
Absolutely.
without a cosigner.
Yes, yes. And I mean, students today are like, what? And I was like, women couldn't have credit on their own. We had to pass a lot of laws in the 60s and the 70s to give women equal access to these types of things. And what this meant is that as women are getting more access to credit, more access to education, more access to take out loans so they can get education, less ability for employers to discriminate against them because they are married or pregnant. I mean, employers used to fire women when they got pregnant or when they got married or either of those things. And now they can't do that anymore. And so what we see is women are becoming, in a way they have not been in US culture, a threat to male jobs. Or that's the way it's perceived.
I think also in a deeper issue, Beth, as women become more able to get credit or able to get a job that pays, they're also able to get out of a marriage that's been destructive and abusive.
Absolutely.
And the church didn't like that.
Yeah, and, I mean, so I teach women's history all the time, and I just taught my European women's history course to 1,200 this past semester. And one of the things we actually talked about were changing divorce laws. And in the early medieval world, women had a lot of access to divorce laws. And they also had this thing where they didn't have to. So, I'm trying to think about how to explain this without using Latin. But in the law, women could get married in one of two ways. They could get married with what we call with hand, and that is where their family, their natal family, gives complete legal authority to their new husband. Or they could get married without hand. And without hand means that they get married, but the legal authority remains with their natal family, the family they were born to, which means that if that woman is being mistreated or something's going on that she doesn't like, she can actually get out of that marriage and go back home, and her family will help her. And this was a huge boon. And I mean, you can think about, why is this? It's to protect women. It's to help protect women and to help protect the assets of their family too. If this man in a different family is mistreating her or is doing something with their money and property that they don't want. But it gave women a lot more freedom. And we start seeing those types of those laws change that don't allow women to have that type of access. And when this happens, we see women less able to get out of abusive marriages, and we see men being given more legal authority to abuse their wives. It has a detrimental impact on women's safety and well-being, and we can see this shift. And in fact, as I was talking, my students are always so bright. As we're talking about this, one of them raised, and she was like, is this what's happening in Texas? Because there had been put forward a new divorce law, a new marriage law, where women, if you got married under this, it's much more difficult to get a divorce for women. And so you can think about, no fault divorce laws protect women because it enables them to get out of abusive situations. And that is not to the advantage of abusive men.
In the book, you talk about a pastor's wife who was undergoing an abusive marriage and some clergy abuse. And, again, even in the United States today, not every state has laws against marital rape.
Right.
That a woman doesn't have a right to say no just because she's a wife. And so I think this is really important, that what does a pastor's wife do when she's married to an abusive man who's abusing her emotionally or physically or sexually or financially or spiritually or all of the above, and she's in ministry with him, or she's the pastor's wife or the missionary's wife or the deacon's wife. We've got a lot of women in our membership who are in that situation. And to speak up is not just wrong for her to do in the whole pastor's wife culture, but it can be really dangerous because she can lose everything.
That's exactly right. When pastors' wives are taught that their whole identity belongs in who their husband is, and their whole spiritual worth is in being a wife and a mom and a supporter of their husband's ministry. And when they're also taught that if their husband's not treating them right, that maybe they're not giving enough. Maybe they're not as sexually available enough. Maybe they're not sacrificing enough. And so then they feel like it's their fault for the way that they're being treated. And then they're not allowed to have close friends in the church. And they're given these firm warnings about not gossiping or undermining their husband's authority because that will hurt the gospel. And then you find a woman who's in this situation who suddenly wakes up one day and realizes that her life is in danger, or the life of her children, or that her husband is maybe not only abusing her, but is abusing her children. And she looks around her, and what can she do? What resources does she have? In some ways, the pastor's wife role is the most visible role in conservative evangelical churches for women in ministry. It's also the most isolated role, because if she speaks out, she is, very likely going to lose everything, and it might not help anyway. She might not be able to get out of that marriage, and so then all she's done is cost her husband her job, and how is that going to work out if they lose? And so there are so few resources for women in this position.
You're so right. And we've, experienced that in our ministry here in our organization. And we have a support group for women, especially in our Conquer membership. We have a special circle group just for pastors' wives or ministry leaders because they have a unique set of challenges.
Yeah.
And it is so hard to believe that God cares about me and my situation more than keeping the institution together. And I was thinking about this before we got in, and I think there's a necessary sometimes sacrifice for the institution. People have gone to war for a country and sacrificed their lives for keeping ourselves safe from communism or terrorists or all those kind of things. And so there's a purpose for sacrificing and suffering, a biblical purpose for the good of the group. But when we're sacrificing and suffering to enable the group to continue to harm ourselves or others, or the institution is wicked or destructive at its core, whether it's the marriage or even the church, some of the church stuff that's going on right now, the institution itself is corrupt and it needs to be dismantled and rebuilt. And if we're not going to tell the truth and stand up against that, and we're sacrificing ourselves only to enable
This is exactly right.
destructive behavior to continue, how is that godly?
That's one of the things that really hit me the most writing this book. I read a book written by two scholars. I don't remember their first names, but it's Knoll, Knoll, and Bolin. And they have a book, they're sociologists, and they have this book called She Preached the Word. And it's just talking about women in ministry throughout the US, all sorts of different types of women in ministry. And one of the things that they found is they found that in conservative churches where the pastor's wife role was put in this very visible position of ministry, that people were less likely to question how the church dealt with women who felt called to other types of ministry, because they felt like that women had a place to serve no matter what, because of the visibility of the pastor's wife role. Which what that means is that by women in the pastor's wife role who continue to support this sort of ideal that this is the only role for women in ministry, that is harming women who feel called to other types of ministry roles. And that was a slap in the face to me, because I was like, my gosh, it never occurred to me that this was not just hurting me, but this was hurting other women. And I think, if you expand that out to think about women in abusive situations, or women who know of women in abusive situations in their churches, but for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the mission, for the sake of the church, they don't help, or they don't try to help, expose that or tell the truth about it, that this is just allowing that type of abuse to grow and spread and hurt more women. And so we are complicit in hurting others, even when we think that maybe it's only about ourselves. That was a hard lesson for me.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. And I think that as women, and most of the people who listen to this podcast probably are women, as women, I think we need to come alongside other women. And, one of the things that woke me up, Beth, as I was a counselor and doing just therapy, family therapy, marriage therapy, individual therapy, was the amount of depressed women that came to my practice. And when we dug into what was going on in their life, they were in a destructive relationship.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a destructive relationship with their husband. Often it was a destructive relationship with other ministry leaders who were gaslighting them, pressuring them to do things that they didn't want to do, they didn't feel gifted to do, but all of a sudden they had to teach children Sunday
Yeah.
school, and they didn't feel like they were capable of teaching children Sunday school, but all of a sudden they felt that pressure, and they weren't allowed to say no. They weren't allowed to say, I'd rather do this, or this is what I want to do. They just had to be the machine or the role
That's exactly
that was
right.
assigned to them.
One of the things that came out really clear to me as I followed this research about the rise of the pastor's wife role from from the church, from the early church, all the way through to the modern era, is I saw what happened when women stopped being gifted and called for who they were, but became gifted and called through who their husbands were. And what this did is this reduced options, reduced choices, reduced who women, the identity of who women actually are in Christ. And it made us less than who we are and who we have been called to be. And it breaks my heart to think that with the rise of such an important role, because I don't want people to come across and think there's something wrong with the pastor's wife role. I think that women who feel called to that position, and I feel I'm really happy being a pastor's wife. I don't want to be in ministry myself in that sense. I just want to, I'm really happy to serve alongside my husband and because I feel called to do other things as my primary job. But other women who when we argue that the pastor's wife role is not only important, but the primary role for women in ministry, that women's job is to support their husbands, and that's their primary calling. What that is doing is that is harming God's calling for other women who don't feel called to that. It's also harming men because there's a whole lot of men who are being thrust into leadership who do not feel called to leadership. And that is harmful too.
It is. And I think, one of the things that I want to leave our women who are listening with is I think one of the most important things for you to do as you're maturing from childhood to adulthood
Mhm.
is to discover you are his workmanship, created to do good things. And I think so often for women in particular, if a little boy was asked when he was a little boy, what do you want to be when you grow up? And all he said was, I just want to be a daddy. They would laugh and they would say, that's great, but what else? But
Right.
for a little girl, when she says, all I want to be is a mommy, it's like, good girl, that's what God wants you to be. And so I think not every woman has to have a career, but I think they all have
Mhm.
a calling. What has
Right.
God gifted you to do? What is God calling you to do? What is your story to contribute to the eternal story? And it might be being the pastor's wife, and that might be your calling, and that's wonderful, but it might be something else. And I just hope that women listening begin to develop the courage to ask themselves and to ask God, God, what did you put inside of me to do? I remember in my
Yes.
church, I went to a very strong Bill Gothard church. Now, I never liked him
Yeah.
and I never went to his stuff, but everybody did. And, they were all dressed in the Laura Ashley dresses. I didn't dress in that. They
Yes.
were all,
Yes.
wearing their hair long. I had my hair short, and they all stayed home and homeschooled their kids, and I didn't. So I was a little outcast in my
Yes.
church. But I remember praying, God, I don't feel called to do any of that. I don't really like any of that. I don't want to do any of
Right.
that. And, I was so grateful that I asked that question, what are you calling me to do? And not letting myself get guilt tripped or pressured
Right.
to do something that was not my gifting to do.
That's exactly right. And I think that's one of the hardest things for women in these spaces because we are taught that if we think about what God is calling us to be, that we're being selfish. And I just want to flip that and be like, what if you're being selfish by not asking, what is it that God wants me to do? Because God is calling us to be his hands and feet in this world. And who are we to say that or to tell God no? And so I just want maybe women to flip that and think about what does it mean to really ask God, what do you want me to do?
Yeah. And instead of having your husband as your God voice,
Exactly.
and I think so often women have especially pastors' wives, but I work with thousands of women who are pastors' wives who have given their husbands the authority to be their God, and they've become they've become husband-centered women instead of
Instead
God-centered
of
women.
God-centered. Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And so to
Yeah,
really say, this is a shift I have to make. I can love my husband, but he's not my source for my identity or my well-being. And if you have a good husband and says, hey, you're an amazing woman and you're, all that, that's wonderful. But a lot of women who are listening to this do not have that kind of husband. And yet it becomes soul crushing because he's become their source of any kind of truth, nourishment, or identity. And that has to change if you're going to start to get healthy and become who God calls you to be.
right, and, it doesn't hurt to help our husbands grow up a little bit too, and, I think, you know, I mean, what would men be? I think I'm so lucky because of who my husband is, but I think what would men be if they didn't feel like they could only do their job with the help of their wives? What if they felt like they were called to do something and to also support and empower their wives in the same way? That would transform marriages. And I think it would put challenges in front of men that should be there, but that we have been protecting men from for a long time.
Agreed. Beth, thanks so much for being with us. Would you be willing to close us in prayer and just pray for those women
Oh,
who are sitting there with their mouths open and scared to death because they're in that
yes.
situation and they know they want to make changes, but fear has a grip?
Yeah, I would love to. God, we just come before you and we know that you are a God who sees. You have seen women from the very beginning of the Bible when you told us the story of Hagar. And when Hagar reached out to you in her pain, she named you the God who sees. And I thank you for being a God who sees women. Every woman who's listening to this, God, you see. And I pray, God, that you just give them the opportunity to um, to be able to change what they can change, God, and to have the courage to speak out if they need to speak out. And that you will bring the people into their lives that they need and the resources into their lives if they need help, God. And I just pray that they will know that they are seen and they are loved by you for who you have made them, God. And I just thank you for being a God who has always cared and elevated women. And it's in the name of your son we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in today, everyone. We've covered some incredible insights, and I hope you're feeling inspired to take action in your life. If you're ready to dive deeper into personal growth and break free from those limiting beliefs, then walking in core strength is your next step. Don't let another day go by feeling stuck and overwhelmed. Head over to leslievernick.com/strength and sign up for Walking in Core Strength today. It's time to reclaim your power and live life on your terms. Until next time, may God bless all of your relationships with Him, with yourself, and with others.